Welcome back to the deep dive. We are jumping right in today because, well, as of right now, the U.S. government is in the middle of yet another shutdown. Yeah, it started October 1st, 2025, and it's ongoing. So we're diving into this whole shutdown mechanism. It feels painful, costly, and frankly, kind of uniquely American. Our mission today is really to give you a shortcut through all the political noise. We want to get you the facts on how these things work, the surprising costs, and maybe understand the history that keeps leading us back here.
Right. And just to set the stage, basically, a shutdown happens when the funding legislation needed for the federal government doesn't pass before the fiscal year starts. Simple as that, really. The result. The government has to pull back on almost everything. It stops non-essential operations, and critically, it furloughs non-essential workers, sends them home without pay. The only people who stay on are those deemed essential, typically because they're protecting human life or property. That definition becomes really key.
Okay, so when we see these images, national parks close, federal workers picketing, we assume it's always been this way. Like, the law always forced this immediate stop. But your sources suggest it's actually a much more recent development, that the hard stop wasn't always mandatory.
That's a really important point. It hasn't always been this strict. The modern requirement for a full shutdown really comes from a specific legal interpretation of something called the Anti-Deficiency Act. This interpretation was locked in by opinions from Attorney General Benjamin Civiletti back in 1980 and 1981.
Civiletti, okay, so what was happening before him? Did agencies just keep going?
Pretty much, yeah. Before those rulings, if Congress missed the deadline, many agencies would just carry on. They'd minimize some non-essential stuff, sure, but the assumption was Congress didn't actually intend for everything to just stop dead while they worked out the funding. But Civiletti's opinions changed that. He ruled that agencies must suspend operations unless a function had and this is the key phrase, reasonable and articulable connection to human safety or protecting property.
Wow. So we went from a sort of soft landing system to basically legislating a cliff edge in the 80s. And what makes it so striking is how unusual this is worldwide. You don't really see other major democracies just shutting down their governments over budget disagreements, do you?
Not really, no, especially not in this way. If you look at parliamentary systems, think the UK, Canada, Australia, lots of places in Europe, a failure to pass the budget is huge. It's often a loss of supply. That usually means a vote of no confidence. The government might fall, parliament could be dissolved, you might get new elections. It's a political crisis, but it resets the whole system rather than just stopping services.
And what about other countries with presidential systems, more like the US?
Even there, it's often different. In many presidential systems, the executive branch might have some authority to keep essential services running, even without a fully approved budget. They often have built-in stopgap measures that are less prone to brinkmanship.
So it's our specific setup, the strict separation of powers, that creates this vulnerability. Congress controls the money. The president can't spend what hasn't been appropriated.
Exactly. That separation means a disagreement over the budget isn't just political. It becomes an immediate operational crisis. Congress holds the purse strings entirely. No appropriation, no spending, full stop.
And the tool they use to try and avoid hitting that wall is the continuing resolution, the CR, kicking the can down the road for a bit.
Right. A CR basically extends current funding levels for a short time to allow negotiations to continue. But, that CR itself becomes the battleground.
Because it needs to pass, too.
Absolutely. The same political forces that lock the main budget bills can block the CR, a president can threaten a veto, or a faction in Congress can use procedural tactics. If they can't even agree on a temporary fix, then, well, the shutdown becomes inevitable.
Okay, so that's the mechanism. Let's talk about the concrete impact. Who actually gets sent home? The sources say the rules around furloughs got really strict, especially after those big fights in the 90s.
Yeah, they did. The moment funding lapses, a huge number of federal civilian employees are furloughed instantly. To give you a sense of scale, back in the 2013 shutdown, that was around 800,000 federal workers.
800,000 people. And what does furloughed actually mean for them? We know no paycheck, but can they, volunteer their time or work from home?
No, absolutely not. And this is where it gets, well, frankly, kind of bizarrely rigid. They are forbidden from doing any work, not even checking their government email. In some cases, agencies actually collect government-issued laptops and phones for the duration. It's a complete stop. This affects non-essential civilian workers, also Title 32 National Guard members, certain military technicians.
They literally lock them out of their jobs. It seems so inefficient, especially when you're talking about skilled professionals.
Yeah.
So who are the exceptions? Who gets to keep working through this?
That emergency personnel category we mentioned, it covers people like active duty military. They always stay on the job. Also, federal law enforcement, like FBI agents, air traffic controllers, doctors and nurses in federal hospitals, like the VA system.
Okay, people directly involved in safety and security. What about Congress? Do representatives and senators get furloughed?
No, members of Congress continue to get paid. The Constitution says their compensation can't be changed except by a specific law, so it's not tied to the annual appropriations process in the same way.
Right. And the mail still gets delivered, doesn't it? That's always the classic example.
Yes, the U.S. Postal Service is kind of a unique case. It's largely self-funded through its own revenues, like selling stamps and services. So it doesn't rely on the annual funding bills that get caught up in these disputes. Your mail carrier keeps coming.
Okay, let's shift to the money, the economic costs. I saw something in the source material that just seems incredible. The cost of the shutdown itself often ends up being more than what it would have cost just to keep the government running. Is that right?
Yes, that's often the case. It sounds completely backwards, but the disruption has massive economic consequences. Let's take that 2013 shutdown again, 16 days long. Standard & Poor's estimated it cost the U.S. economy about $24 billion. They figured it shaved at least 0.6% off the annualized GDP growth for that quarter. That's a real measurable hit to the whole economy.
$24 billion. Just vanished economic activity. And what about the longest shutdown, the one in 2018-2019?
That one lasted 35 days. The Congressional Budget Office estimated the cost at around $11 billion over the 2 quarters it affected. But here's the kicker. About $3 billion of that $11 billion was just the cost of eventually paying the furloughed workers their back pay once the government reopened.
So they didn't save money by not paying them during the shutdown. They just delayed the payment and caused disruption.
Exactly. Plus, there was an estimated $2 billion in lost tax revenue because the IRS wasn't fully operational, meaning less enforcement and compliance activity. So, yeah, you spend the money anyway on back pay, plus you lose revenue, plus you have all the broader economic damage. It's not fiscally sound.
It really does sound like economic self-sabotage. But those are the costs we can sort of count, right? What about the impacts that are harder to put a number on, these shadow costs?
Yes. Those are incredibly important and often overlooked. We're talking about things like long-term scientific research projects being completely ruined because data collection stopped midstream. Think environmental monitoring, medical studies. You also see delays in federal investment, projects getting pushed back, and deferred maintenance, especially in places like national parks. They shut down or operate on a skeleton crew, and needed repairs just don't happen, which costs more later. These effects linger long after the lights come back on.
This pattern isn't new, though. You mentioned the 90s. Let's look at some of the really big historical shutdowns, because they weren't just fights over numbers, were they? They were about deep policy disagreements.
Yeah.
Maybe start with that 1995-1996 clash. That was a big one, right? Clinton versus Newt Gingrich's Republican Congress lasted 21 days.
Yes, that was really a watershed moment. The core fight was over the Republicans' proposed deep cuts to spending on things like education, the environment, and crucially, Medicare and Medicaid, major policy differences. And the political fallout was significant. Public opinion largely blamed the Republican Congress, particularly Speaker Gingrich. It damaged his standing, while President Clinton's actually improved. Many analysts think it played a big role in Clinton's reelection in 1996.
So taking the blame can be politically costly. Okay, jump forward to 2013. 16 days under President Obama. What was the fight about then?
That one was almost entirely focused on the Affordable Care Act, the ACA, or Obamacare. Opponents in Congress wanted to defund it or at least delay its implementation as part of the budget deal.
And the impact. We mentioned 800,000 furloughed workers. What else?
The disruption hit a lot of critical areas. Services for Native American communities, Head Start programs for young children, funding streams for domestic violence shelters, even processing for asylum seekers and immigration cases got gummed up. And again, politically, opinion polls generally showed the public viewed the Republican stance negatively. It highlighted the risks of using the shutdown as leverage on a specific policy issue.
Which brings us to the longest one ever, 35 days in 2018-2019. The fight there was over funding for the U.S.-Mexico border wall, right?
That's right. President Trump was demanding about $5.7 billion specifically for wall construction, and Democrats in Congress refused. That stalemate led to the record-breaking shutdown.
What finally broke the deadlock after 35 days? That's over a month.
It was really the accumulating pressure on essential systems. You started seeing significant staff shortages in places like the TSA, the Transportation Security Administration. People were calling in sick because they weren't getting paid. That led to longer lines, even some airport terminal closures. But the real tipping point seemed to be when a growing number of air traffic controllers started missing work. That caused major flight delays and cancellations nationwide. The pressure on public safety and the economy just became too intense.
So the system itself started to buckle under the strain, which leads to the big question, I guess. Looking at all this, the cost, the disruption, the history, is this shutdown mechanism a fundamental flaw in the American system? Or is it, maybe perversely, some kind of feature?
Well, the sources offer different perspectives on that, and it's worth looking at them impartially. On one hand, you have critics like the moral philosopher Peter Singer. He basically argued that shutdowns are clear evidence of a fundamental flaw in the U.S. Constitution's design, specifically the separation of powers, that it inherently allows for this kind of paralysis.
Okay, so that's the design flaw argument. What's the counter-argument? That it serves some purpose.
Some see it as a form of political brinkmanship or coercion, a way for one side to force concessions from the other when normal legislative processes fail. It's high-stakes negotiation, essentially. Others take a slightly different tack. Michael Schindler, for instance, argued shutdowns actually protect popular sovereignty. His point was that they force the country to confront deep ideological divides that might otherwise be papered over. They reveal when the exercise of sovereignty has become really difficult because people disagree so fundamentally.
That's an interesting take. Forcing a confrontation with disagreement?
And Ezra Klein made a somewhat related argument, suggesting a shutdown could even be seen as a form of resistance against what might be perceived as a corrupting government, a way to stop the machine when you believe it's going in a dangerous direction.
So, tool of coercion, symptom of deep division, or necessary resistance. But regardless of how you frame it, the cycle is happening again, right now, in 2025. The funding lapse, the stalemate, the economic hit, it continues. I think the key takeaway, really pulling it all together, is that this whole mechanism from that civil eddy interpretation back in 1980 right up to today's gridlock is deeply embedded in U.S. law and our specific political structure. It creates this recurring crisis that seems almost uniquely American and largely self-inflicted.
Absolutely. And maybe one final thought to leave people with, something provocative perhaps. We focus so much on the drama in Washington, D.C., the federal shutdown. But the sources point out that state governments, even territorial governments, can and do shut down too when their budgets fail. And sometimes those shutdowns last much longer than the federal ones. Think about this. California had a 63-day shutdown in 1992. Connecticut shut down for 54 days in 1991.
Wow, 63 days, over 2 months.
Exactly. When you consider the sheer length of those state-level crises and how directly they must have impacted people's daily lives, schools, state services, everything, it really makes you think. Maybe the gridlock, the inability to consistently fund basic government functions, isn't just a Washington problem. Maybe it tells us something deeper about challenges across our entire democratic system, far beyond Congress.
That really puts it in perspective, realizing states can be paralyzed for that long. It definitely broadens the scope of the issue. Something to certainly think about as we watch this current federal situation play out.
There you go.
Well, thank you for that deep dive, and thank you for joining us.